I spent over a year working on what I thought was my dream game. It was an action RPG and it was very ambitious. But then I stopped. Now I'm working on a new project, a roguelike where you pissed off every single god from every mythology. You stack items and you create unique builds in order to fight off the waves of enemies and bosses. But why did I switch? Well, there are a lot of reasons why, and I'll go over all of them in this video. But right now, I'm going to jump back into development for my new roguelike project Myth. In the last video, I had just covered the first 25 days of work, and the game had a solid working game loop where you could buy items and fight enemies. And so in this video, I'm going to be spending another 25 days improving this base, adding new enemies, items, and mechanics, and then finally building the first boss fight. So let's get into it. Last video, I left off right after adding status effects and some UI for those status effects to the game. This framework should allow me to make lots of new effects and items in the future. And so on day 26, I improved it further, creating a small class called a stackable value. This is just a little data container that I can use to easily add values to item effects that stack. And it just consists of a base value, a stack change value, and a stack method. But that's boring. Let's make some enemies. So on day 27, I started on the first new enemy, the Dai Tengu. Tengu are a sort of Japanese yokai. There are a bunch of different types, from Karasu Tengu, which are more crow-like, to Dai Tengu, which are the long-nosed red ones. Dai Tengu are smart, and they are often master swordsmen, but they can also be extremely cruel. I put together a sprite with a walking and an attack animation. In my game, Dai Tengu will be the first enemy with a melee attack, so it's time to set that up. Melee attacks are going to be pretty simple. There's just a box that gets checked, and if the player is found in that box, then the attack is triggered, playing an animation and enabling the sword's collision. The Dai Tengu will only attack right in front of themselves, so they can be dealt with by bouncing on them, quickly darting in and out of their range, or by using ranged attacks. But if they do hit you, it does quite a bit of damage, and they are pretty tanky. On day 28, I continued polishing the Dai Tengu, fixing some glitches and bouncing it a bit. And I also made a chest sprite with an animation where the lid flies off it whenever you open it, just to give you that little dopamine shot. Because all good game design pretty much just comes down to building a glorified Skinner box. On day 29, I started looking around for what my next enemy should be. I like a new flying enemy, and I found some accounts of flying snakes in Egyptian mythology, so I made a sprite for this flying snake. They'll shoot poison projectiles at you. I don't plan on making these give you a poison status effects, although maybe a stronger version of the enemy could do that. So it turns out that finding mythological creatures is a bit harder than I thought it would be, at least for some mythologies. Because in lots of these, gods are a lot more focused on. While I do plan on sticking to just the most major mythologies for the gods, for enemies I decided to draw from as wide a range for creatures and monsters as possible. So if you know some cool creatures from your culture's folklore and would like me to maybe put them in the game, then comment them down below. I'm making a list of ones that seem promising. So, if Project Seaborn was my dream game, why am I suddenly focusing on a completely different game now? Well, the main reason is that I would like to actually release a game within the next year or so. And Project Seaborn just has a much larger scope than that. The other is that I wasn't totally happy with how Project Seaborn was going. I made a lot of progress, and there was a lot of stuff in the game, but it wasn't all that fun to play or develop at the time. Despite putting tons of time into the art, I could never really get its more detailed style to look good enough. And though I was proud of the unique battle system, it wasn't really working for me, so I'll keep working on Project Seaborn in the background. But it'll be more planning and story focused, as my hope for the game is to make a game with compelling and unique RPG gameplay, but also with a good story. And I have a very long way to go before I can really pull off either, so I'm instead putting my time into this roguelike instead. In some ways, Project Myth is a bit of a dream game though as well, but it's in a very different way. This isn't some game that I really wish existed. Though I think it'll be fun, it's more so a game that I would really like to develop. It's making enemies, items, and roguelike mechanics are all things that I've always wanted to design and program. Roguelikes are really interesting from a design perspective, and I've had a blast making the game so far. So let's get back to development. So on day 30, I did more work on the flying snake, making animations for it and making it shoot the projectile. It was super easy to make, as I already have flying movement and projectile attacks in the game, so I just added them both. I finished up the day by making 3 new sprites for items, and on the next day I polished up the 2 new enemies, adding particles and polishing up their behaviors a bit. On day 32, I drew some more enemy sprites, a minotaur which I didn't get to in this devlog, and a dwarf enemy. He's basically a combination of the Dai Tengu and the Archer Centaur, and he has an axe that he throws whenever he's far away, but if he gets close to you, he'll attack with a melee slash. To finish up day 33, I made a throwing animation and I completed that attack. So on day 34, I animated the Minotaur's running animation. But also, unfortunately, at about this time in development, I encountered my 4 horsemen of game development unproductivity. First off and least importantly, finals week in college. Then the release of Hades 2, then Baltro, and finally spending way too much time reading Mistborn. But after several days of not touching the project, it's now summertime, and also officially day 35 of work on the game. So I got the dwarf's melee attack to work, and he's now complete. Honestly, despite the dwarf just being a combination of 2 other enemies, he's probably my favorite I've made so far, as he's just really fun to watch run around. And on day 36, I switched from just making new enemies to finally upgrading the shop. I made lots of new chest sprites. These chests have many categories, from damage to movement to economy, and there are also big chests and legendary chests now. The big chests have an 80% chance of giving you a rare item and a 20% chance of giving you a legendary, while the legendary chests have a 100% chance of giving you a legendary. I also made a 2-choice shop now, where you can choose between 2 different items. I think these changes should give you a little bit more power over your build, and also just make the shop a bit more interesting. And on day 37, I continued to work on the shop, and I added a brand new mechanic which I'm pretty proud of. You can choose 1 chest to lock, and this chest will stay in the shop between rounds until you either remove the lock or you buy it. So if there's a chest which you really want, but you can't quite afford, you can lock it in until you can afford it. This works by just storing a few values in the shop manager and then by loading in the chest whenever you load a new shop. If you have a chest locked, then there is somewhat of a cost, as now that slot doesn't have a chance of giving you something better. So you need to be somewhat thoughtful whenever locking chests. On day 38, I made a few new items. I'm still experimenting with different mechanics and ideas for items right now, but one I added was an item that ups your defense for a few seconds whenever you fall below 25% HP. In order to do this, I had to set up an equation for defense boosts, as now I not only have the normal defense stat, but also boosts that add to it. But this was kinda tricky to figure out, as I had to ensure the defense never reaches 1, because that would mean that 100% of damage is blocked. But I also had to make sure the defense always increases for each source. So I ended up with this equation, where there's 1 minus the product of 1 minus x times the product of 1 minus y, and continue, where x, y, and so on are sources of defense. This will always get closer to 1, but will never exactly reach it, and the boosts add up in a way that makes sense. So I also used it with the next item, which just adds a bunch of defense whenever you dash. Then I made an item that increases damage whenever you bounce on enemies, one that adds a dodge chance, and one that increases weapon size. Right now most of these items just have placeholder names and sprites, but I'll eventually make real ones based on different items from mythologies. For now, I'm just trying stuff out. On day 39, I did some playtesting, and I found a few issues. First off, the item that gives you defense for a few seconds whenever you're low HP absolutely sucks, as there is no healing in this game outside of flasks which you buy at the shop. Having 5 seconds of higher defense means absolutely nothing. So I instead switched it to a stat that is always active whenever you are below 25% HP. I need to add some item visualizations in the future, as right now it's impossible to tell what a lot of items are doing unless you look really closely at the damage you take and deal. And I also added some other quality of life things here as well, like rarity outlines for items, a wave counter, a placeholder death screen, and a 2-choice shop, which always spawns, giving you just a bit more control over your items. On day 40, I finally made a nice particle effect for the item that makes enemies explode whenever they die. Then I got to adding a money multiplier to the game. The main name that I'm considering for the game right now is Myth Dash, as I want to emphasize how the game encourages you to kill enemies quickly, so I should probably actually add some sort of combo system to the game. It's pretty simple. You lose the money multiplier over time, and also whenever you take damage. But you freeze the overtime loss whenever you deal damage, and you raise the multiplier whenever you kill an enemy, encouraging you to always be in combat and always killing enemies. I also made a change for how money is stored, switching it internally to a float with decimals instead of an integer. This is so that the multipliers actually have a consistent effect with lower values of money, as rounding out the decimal would have led to some weird results. However, for actually buying stuff and how the player sees it in game, it's just an integer with the decimals chopped off. And on day 41, I started a new secondary attack. It's just a simple projectile that you can fire horizontally, and I made it so that you charge up the secondary attack by using your primary attack. This is so that the game will always be more focused on the melee primary attack. But now you also have a secondary attack, which adds a few more options and some more thinking to gameplay. On day 42, I polished the secondary attack more, adding UI and animation for it. Then I did some bug fixing, and I launched into finally making the base for boss fights. Continuing into the next day, boss fights are a big deal, as you'll be facing one at the end of every stage, and I want these to be the parts of the game where you really are in danger of dying, so building a good framework is very important. I'm just starting with a base for my last game, Project Seaborn, so bosses are just enemies with an extra script on them to handle some extra behavior, which includes things like multiple stages. Like a couple of other things in this game, while I am basing the code on stuff from Project Seaborn, I'm changing up a lot of things that didn't work. For boss fights, that mostly just means cleaning up the code and making a boss fight manager script to do most of the work with UI and stage setup, which used to be haphazardly spread across a bunch of scripts. Whenever you enter a boss fight, there's a quick camera zoom and a name and a title for the boss. Then the boss fight starts, and there's a big health bar on screen. Finally, whenever you beat the boss, it zooms back in and a death animation plays. So on day 44, I decided what the first boss will be. Right now, the only stage is just a generic grass thing. but I eventually want to turn this first stage into Mount Olympus, which will be the first stage and where you fight some Greek Olympians. And the first one will be Ares, Greek god of war. More specifically, Ares is a god of slaughter and bloodshed, mostly the darker parts of war, although he's also a god of bravery. So for this Ares boss fight, the basic plan is for him to have a bunch of weapons and a shield, and you'll have to get around that shield in order to deal damage, usually by attacking while he attacks or whenever he's recovering from his attacks. On day 45, I made most of the art for the boss fight other than Ares himself, including an arena for you to fight him in. It's pretty empty right now. And on day 46, I started on Ares attacks, creating a new sort of attack portion for enemies, add force attacks. These will mostly be jumping and dashing things. For Ares, this will be a jump where he tries to land on a player, creating 2 wave projectiles from which you must also avoid. In order to program this attack, I had to reprogram the entire enemy movement system? Yeah. Up to now, I've actually not used Unity's physics for enemy movement. And while that was fine for basic flying, walking, and jumping, if I want to make Ares jump on your head, I need to do some physics calculations. And so my pseudo-physics aren't really going to cut it anymore. So on day 47, I reworked physics for all enemies, which was annoying, but it works pretty well now. I'll just need to make some more adjustments over time, but now I can finally make the jump attack. So on day 48, I completed the jump attack, using projectile motion calculations to make sure that it lands on the player, and I also made him slam down a bit, making it harder to dodge. And then whenever he lands, I spawn in the 2 projectiles. The next attack is a sword combo attack, where he just slashes a few times, moving forwards a bit with each one. And this was pretty easy to get the basic sub working. But on day 49, I finally got to making some art for Ares himself. It isn't great, but it sort of works, so now it's time to finish out the behavior for the attacks. I started on some animations and then fixed some bugs, and now the 2 attacks work pretty well. So I added shielding, which was pretty simple actually. The player attack just checks that the shield is closer to the player than the enemy is whenever it hits it, and if it is closer, then it blocks the damage and knocks the player back a bit. Finally, on day 50, I added a bunch of particles to shielding and attacking for Ares. And I also finally made a good door sprite for moving between the library and the battle stages, and made the shield move up whenever the player is above Ares. And the rest of the day was spent polishing the attacks, making Ares actually walk around and making a new, somewhat better sprite for Ares. And finally making a new attack. This attack has 2 parts. First off, Ares jumps to the right of the stage, and then he pulls out a spear and he throws it. I made his animation and code and stuff, and while it mostly works, it is still a bit glitchy sometimes. Right now, I think that the Ares boss fight is in a good place, but it still has some bugs and can use another attack or 2. But time is up for this devlog, so I'm already halfway to my 100-day deadline. At the 100th day, I will release a Steam demo for the game, which should be completely playable. At that point, I'll go into content mode, creating lots of new stages, enemies, bosses, and items, eventually leading up to a final release. But for the next 25 days, I'm going to finish up this boss fight and then start polishing up the UI, adding menus, and adding a few brand new mechanics. So subscribe to follow further development. Anyways, thanks for watching. Bye.